How's it going, OSA? Today we're going to be talking about one of the most confounding and technical aspects of aquarium keeping, and it's going to be lighting. So today we're going to be talking about lighting. So what exactly is light? How does it affect the critters in my aquarium? How can I pick the right light so I can grow the right critters that I want in my aquarium? And how can I also pick my light so that my aquarium looks good and does everything that I want to do as far as looking great and making this fantastic aesthetic presence in my home. When you look out and a little bit of raw sunlight bleeds through a window, what you're looking at is essentially, it looks like golden white light to us, right? And especially when we look around, this looks like clear white light. Now, there is no real white spectrum of light. When it comes to light, there's this big spectrum, and it's called the electromagnetic spectrum. And today we're just going to be concerned with a very small middle fraction of it, and that's the visible spectrum. And there's essentially three main colors that make up all visible light, and those are red, greens, and blues. Now these three major spectrum of light combine together to make white light. So when you see raw sunlight coming through, or even white light from like a department store or the supermarket, this is more or less the full spectrum of visible light. Not necessarily UV or infrared, but you're having reds, greens, and blues all thrown at you, and then that is being portrayed to your eye as white or clear. Today we'll be going through those three main spectrum of light, the reds, the greens, and the blues, and then we'll be going through how we're going to use them to make our aquariums function biologically and then also pop visually. We'll start with this raw sunlight. So raw sunlight's coming in, and we can see that terrestrial plants are green, at least most of them are. Now why is that? The way things work, which is extremely counterintuitive, is that the color that an organism reflects is the spectrum of light which they are not absorbing. So if something is green, it's because they are not absorbing the green spectrum of light. It means that they're throwing that back, and then your eye is picking it up and it looks green. What these guys are doing, because they're green, is they're absorbing red spectrum of light. So when this sunlight is coming through, there are pigments inside the cells of these plants, and then they are acting as micro solar panels, and they're attracting a particular spectrum of light. So we'll be going through the three main spectrums and then how they play a role in actual aquariums. So the first spectrum we'll be talking about is the red spectrum. So red spectrum of light is roughly about 400 to, just before 500 nanometers in length. The shorter a nanometerage is, so 400 nanometers versus 700 nanometers, the shorter it is, the more energy that it has. The more energy that the light has, there's certain repercussions. One, the more photosynthetic power it can have. That's why most land plants are green, because they're designed to absorb all that really powerful red light. And two, it depends on how that organism will behave in the presence of red light versus the rest of the spectrum. So if we're trying to go for a planted aquarium in the freshwater, most of what we have is chlorophytes. So things that are basically terrestrial plants that happen to live underwater. So in that regard, we have to treat them like terrestrial plants. Now, what terrestrial plants and the green algae, the chlorophytes, and if you want to learn more about them, go back to our algae video. What they have in common is that they primarily depend on chlorophyll A. Now chlorophyll A, think of it as this micro nano solar panel that God, nature, evolution has developed. This beautiful component that allows the actual photons of light to be converted into sugars. It's like the big shebang, the big magic. That's all chlorophyll A. Now, all photosynthetic critters, be them a coral, a plant, a lichen, photosynthetic fungus, they all have chlorophyll A to actually conduct photosynthesis. Now, the different colors that make different photosynthetic critters, either green, purple, blue, brown, these are all accessory pigments. Their job is not to convert light energy into sugars per se. Their job is to give chlorophyll A more energy from more spectrum of light. So that's a long way of saying that when we're looking at a green plant, we're concerned with chlorophyll A and maybe a little bit of chlorophyll C. Long story short, that means that they want red light. Now you'll see here that a lot of our lights that we have on them aren't quite red like you would see in like an industrial grow house or something like that. Instead, they're more of a white combination. Now this has a couple of things with it. One is that white light does have more red spectrum in it than, let's say, a coral light that's much more blue that we'll talk about later. But with white lights, you're really going to want to depend on certain scales that will help you. And one of those things is called the Kelvin scale. Now this is a way of taking white light and organizing it into more red and more blue. So long story short, the lower Kelvin reading that you have is a white light that peaks more with the red. So if you wanted to get an LED that was, let's say, 4100 Kelvin, that would be a lot more appropriate for growing freshwater plants than, let's say, an LED that was at 6500 Kelvin. That would be all white but peaking a little bit more in the blue. These guys are a little bit more blue than red because you also want to consider the fact that more bluish white light and higher Kelvin readings give you a little bit more of a clean look as well. And if you have too much red light in the aquarium, there'll be an excess of available photons and you might get pest algae, such as annoying green algae as well. But long story short, when you're trying to grow green plants, be them terrestrial or freshwater, red spectrum light, or at least white spectrum light with a lot of red peak is your friend. So the middle spectrum of light, that's green light. Now you'll notice that very few aquariums are illuminated straight green, and there's a pretty good reason for that. Unlike with red light and white light and blue light, which corals need, there's not really any direct need that most photosynthetic organisms have for green light. What green light helps with more or less is to kind of diffuse and contextualize the other spectrums of light. If a plant gets too much red light, things can go wrong. If a coral gets too much blue light, things can go wrong. So a little bit of green light helps diffuse and contextualize the absorption of photons amongst the different photosynthetic apparatuses that these different critters have. We won't talk about that. So green light more or less plays a role a little less in biological functionality and a little bit more in display quality. Green light really reacts with certain chromatophores or skin pigment cells that fish develop. We'll have a different video on why fish look the way they do, but you'll notice that under certain spectrums of light, fish will pop a lot more than in others. If you have a coral tank that's just for grow out and it has predominantly just blue spectrum of light, which we'll talk about, your fish may not pop the way that they would necessarily if you had a little bit more green in there that would react with the tunizanth and some of the other novel pigment compounds that some of the fish have. So when it comes to green light, its best utility is displaying the fish and really displaying and really celebrating their true colors. And when we're talking about the Kelvin reading, if 4100 Kelvin was all white peaking at the red spectrum, then 5000 Kelvin would be a good measure for all white and then peaking at the green spectrum. And then this can be played around with depending on the fish that you have, their colorations, and how much green light you want to make them look fantastic. So by far the most difficult to understand and at the same time most interesting spectrum of light is the blue spectrum. So this is about 600 to 700 nanometers in length. It's very long, so compared to the red spectrum, it doesn't have as much energy. But when you contextualize that as to what happens in the wild, things get very interesting. So imagine that you're in salt water, like let's say 20 feet of salt water. By the time you're down about 5-6 feet, all of that red light is gone. It just gets sucked up by everything that's even at the surface, even if the water is apparently crystal clear. When you go down, even in crystal clear water, you'll find that it's only that blue spectrum of light that is reaching down more than a few feet, which is why corals and many other marine photosynthetic organisms have adapted to utilize blue light. This is because their algae have things, accessory pigments like fucoxanthin, which specialize in absorbing this blue light. This is where the aquarium industry had one of its first major hurdles with lighting. So with plants, we had greenhouses, we had, fluorescent lights, metal halide lights that were pretty competent in being able to produce white light and maybe even some red light. And of course, we had agriculture to provide a model. Growing these things weren't quite as difficult as simulating the lighting that these marine organisms get. So this was the bane of the existence of all coral keepers throughout the 20th century, trying to find the exact spectrum of light and being able to get lighting apparatuses that were able to replicate it. Because not all corals like the same intensity of light. They don't like all the same PAR reading, and not all corals enjoy the same particular spectrum of light. So one of the greatest things that's happened since the 2000s is the real advance and embrace of light-emitting diode technology, LEDs. LEDs are great because they're more energy efficient, they're brighter, they can be modified to emit different spectrum of light, and multiple different diodes can be connected to the same fixture so that you can emit multiple different spectras in scattered and localized areas. So for that reason, one of the greatest things that has happened for people in the aquarium industry is having access to fantastic lights such as the AI Prime. Now, I love this product. I think it's one of the greatest things that we sell here at the shop for the money, and that's because it is very powerful, compact LED. It'll spread across a lot of areas. Its intensity can be reduced, so there's this thing called photosynthetic intensity spectrum. So you don't want to throw too much light at your corals all at once, but you don't necessarily want to be throwing shade cloth over or switching out lights. So the ability to change out your intensity is key. The ability to control your spectrum is key. This has a really helpful and intuitive app where literally you can just use your smartphone and you can alter the different spectrum of light. If you want more reds, if you want more blues, if you want more whites, and then you can set the schedule on that. So being able to control the spectrum, intensity, and schedule of your lighting is really the greatest thing that the modern day aquarist has, and being able to control both the aesthetic appeal of your aquarium. I want it to look fantastic, so I'm having a cocktail party, so I'll set it to lighting settings that are much more white than my corals really need. I won't grow pest algae because I won't have it on for a week, but if I have it on for 3 hours, it'll make the tank look fantastic. But for the rest of the time, I can set my lighting schedule so it's deep blue, so I'm only interacting with the photosynthetic organisms that are in the coral and not necessarily a bunch of waste green pest algae. So by having light emitting technology like this, where we can control the spectrum and the intensity, you really can do wonderful things. Now that being said, lighting is a very complex subject, so if you have any questions on what lighting fixture to get, for what tank and what critters you want, feel free to come on by and ask us as many questions as you want. That's why we're here. So keep on reefing, keep on planting, and keep it lighted.